She vanished without a trace. Some called her a miracle worker, others called her a fraud. Who was Aimee Semple McPherson, the woman who captivated millions, sparked a religious revolution, and disappeared under mysterious circumstances for weeks? In this video, we unravel the shocking truths, the miracles, the fame, and the controversy behind one of the most polarizing figures in American religious history. From the rise of her empire to the disappearance that shocked a nation, this is a story of power, faith, and mystery you won't believe until you see it. Before we dive into her incredible life, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video, because this is a story you'll want everyone to witness. Now, let's uncover the untold story of Aimee Semple McPherson. In the early years of the 20th century, when America was still finding its voice and women were rarely allowed to raise theirs, one woman rose, fearless, magnetic, and impossible to ignore. Her name was Aimee Semple McPherson, and whether you believed in her miracles or doubted her motives, one truth was undeniable. When she entered a room, history leaned in to listen. This was not supposed to happen. She was not born into power. She did not come from wealth, royalty, or privilege. She came from a small town in Ontario, Canada, born in 1890 to a devout Salvation Army mother and a skeptical father who questioned faith more than he embraced it. From the beginning, Aimee's life was shaped by tension between belief and doubt, fire and reason, heaven and earth. That tension would one day explode onto the world stage. As a child, Aimee was curious, imaginative, and fiercely expressive. While other children played quietly, she staged sermons for imaginary crowds, preaching with dramatic gestures and unshakable confidence. Her mother saw it as a calling. Others dismissed it as childish fantasy. No one imagined that this little girl would one day command audiences of tens of thousands, broadcast sermons across the nation, and redefine modern Christianity forever. But destiny rarely announces itself gently. At 17, Aimee encountered the Pentecostal movement, a radical, emotional, controversial wave of Christianity that emphasized miracles, divine healing, and the direct power of the Holy Spirit. For Aimee, it was not just a belief system, it was an awakening. She claimed to experience a profound spiritual transformation, one that filled her with what she described as divine fire. She spoke of visions, callings, and a voice urging her forward, beyond the limits placed on women, beyond tradition, beyond fear. It was during this time that she met Robert Semple, a passionate missionary who shared her zeal. Together, they dreamed of spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth. Their love burned quickly and intensely, fueled by faith and ambition. Soon after marrying, they set out for China, young, idealistic, and utterly unprepared for the hardship that awaited them. Tragedy struck swiftly. In 1910, Robert Semple died of malaria in Hong Kong, leaving Aimee widowed, pregnant, and shattered. She was just 19 years old. Many would have retreated into obscurity, broken by grief, but Aimee did the opposite. She returned transformed, not weakened, but forged. She later spoke of this moment as the crucible that sealed her calling. If death could not silence her faith, nothing would. Yet life was far from settled. Aimee remarried, this time to Harold McPherson, hoping for stability, but her calling refused to be domesticated. Motherhood, marriage, and ministry collided, and the pressure became unbearable. She claimed God demanded her full obedience, that she could not be both a conventional wife and the evangelist she was meant to be. Eventually, she chose the pulpit over the marriage, a decision that shocked and scandalized many. Now alone again, with children to raise and no institutional support, Aimee did something unprecedented. She stepped onto the road. Armed with nothing but a Bible, an unshakable voice, and absolute conviction, she began traveling across America in a beat-up car she called the gospel car. Town by town, tent by tent, she preached with theatrical flair and emotional power that electrified crowds. She spoke of healing, and people claimed to be healed. She prayed, and the sick rose from stretchers. Skeptics scoffed, but testimonies poured in. Word spread fast. By the early 1920s, Aimee Semple McPherson was no longer just a preacher, she was a phenomenon. Newspapers followed her movements, cities fought to host her crusades. She drew crowds larger than many politicians at a time when women weren't even allowed to vote nationwide. Her sermons were dramatic productions, complete with costumes, props, and vivid storytelling. Critics mocked her theatrics, supporters called her anointed. Then came Angelus Temple. In the heart of Los Angeles in 1923, Aimee opened a massive domed church that seated over 5,000 people. It was one of the first megachurches in American history. But Angelus Temple was more than a building. It was a stage, a broadcast center, a movement hub. From there, Aimee launched one of the first Christian radio stations, reaching millions at a time when radio itself was still new. She had mastered modern media before most people understood its power. To her followers, she was God's chosen vessel. To her critics, she was a dangerous performer, blurring the line between faith and spectacle. Rumors followed her everywhere about her finances, her healings, her relationships. Fame magnified everything. The higher she rose, the sharper the knives became. And yet, through it all, she kept drawing crowds. She preached salvation, she preached healing, she preached hope to the broken and the forgotten. During the Great Depression, she fed thousands through church-run soup kitchens. She comforted the desperate when institutions failed them. For many, she was not just a preacher, she was a lifeline. But behind the lights, the applause, and the miracles, something darker was forming. The pressure of fame, the scrutiny, the whispers, the enemies. Because when someone rises this fast, this high, the fall, if it comes, never comes quietly. And in 1926, at the height of her power, Aimee Semple McPherson vanished. No warning, no explanation. One moment she was a national icon, the next she was gone. And what would follow would shock America, divide the church, ignite scandal, and forever change how her name would be remembered. In the next section, we step into the day she disappeared, the beach, the rumors, the panic, and the moment the nation realized this was no ordinary missing person case. Because Aimee Semple McPherson didn't just disappear, she became a mystery. On the afternoon of May 18, 1926, the sun hung calmly over the California coastline, unaware that history was about to fracture. The Pacific Ocean rolled in gentle waves near Venice Beach, sparkling under the sky. It should have been an ordinary day, but it would become one of the most haunting moments in American religious history. That morning, Aimee Semple McPherson told her secretary she needed rest. Exhaustion had been stalking her for months. Grueling sermons, relentless travel, constant scrutiny. She decided to go to the beach to clear her mind. Nothing about her departure felt unusual. No dramatic farewell, no ominous warning. She walked into the sunlight, and then she was gone. When hours passed with no word, concern began to ripple. By evening, panic took hold. Friends searched the shoreline, police were called, crowds gathered. And then, near the water's edge, something chilling was discovered. Aimee's clothes, neatly folded beside the sea. The implication was immediate and devastating. America assumed the worst. Within hours, newspapers exploded with headlines announcing her presumed death. Evangelist drowned, they declared. Radio stations interrupted programming. Churches fell silent. Angelus Temple overflowed with grieving followers, many weeping openly, others praying desperately for a miracle. If she was dead, it was tragic. If she wasn't, then where was she? Authorities launched a full-scale search. Boats combed the waters, divers plunged beneath the waves. Days passed, nothing surfaced, no body, no sign, no explanation, just absence. As grief turned into disbelief, something else crept in: doubt. Because Aimee Semple McPherson was not an ordinary figure. She was controversial, theatrical, and powerful. She had enemies, plenty of them. Skeptics whispered that something didn't feel right. How could such a public figure vanish without a trace? Why were her clothes folded so carefully? Why no struggle? Why no witnesses? The questions multiplied. 10 days passed, then 20. Hope faded. Memorial services were planned. Sermons were preached in her honor. Some hailed her as a martyr of faith. Others quietly sharpened their skepticism. And then, when the story seemed settled, when the nation had already mourned, Aimee came back. On June 23, 1926, more than 5 weeks after her disappearance, she reappeared in Agua Prieta, Mexico, staggering into town barefoot, disheveled, and visibly exhausted. Her clothes were torn, her face was gaunt, she was barely able to stand. The news detonated across the country. Alive? How? She told a harrowing story. According to Aimee, she had been kidnapped from the beach by a man and a woman who lured her under the pretense of helping a sick child. She claimed she was drugged, transported across borders, held captive in a remote shack, and threatened with death unless her church paid a ransom. She said she escaped by crawling through the desert for miles, surviving on faith alone. To her supporters, it was a miracle. To her critics, it was impossible. The disbelief was immediate and fierce. Journalists rushed to dissect every detail. Law enforcement raised eyebrows. The story didn't add up, at least not cleanly. There was no ransom note, no credible witnesses, no physical evidence of captivity beyond her condition. And then came the rumors. Some claimed she had staged the entire disappearance. Others alleged she had been hiding with a secret lover. Names surfaced. Accusations grew louder. What had once been a spiritual movement now felt like a courtroom drama played out in public view. The media frenzy was relentless. Newspapers published conflicting narratives daily. One headline painted her as a victim of a heinous crime. The next suggested deceit and manipulation. The same woman who once filled pages with revival testimonies now dominated columns of scandal. The public was divided. Her followers rallied fiercely around her. They packed Angelus Temple again, shouting praises and thanking God for her return. They believed her without hesitation. Faith, after all, does not demand proof, it demands trust. But others were unconvinced. Why had she crossed the border? Why were there inconsistencies in her timeline? Why had she never reported the kidnapping immediately? Prosecutors began investigating whether her disappearance had been fabricated. Suddenly, Aimee Semple McPherson wasn't just a preacher, she was a suspect. Charges were considered, then dropped, then reconsidered. Witnesses contradicted each other. Evidence evaporated. The case became a tangle of speculation, politics, and public pressure. In the end, no one was convicted. No definitive truth was established. The official files closed without resolution. But the damage was done. Her reputation, once untouchable, was fractured. To some, she would forever be the woman who survived the impossible. To others, she would always be the woman who staged the greatest religious scandal of her era. And yet, she refused to disappear again. Despite the controversy, Aimee returned to the pulpit. She preached with renewed fire. She framed her survival as divine deliverance. Crowds still came. Miracles still claimed. The movement endured. But something had changed. The innocence was gone. The spotlight was harsher, and the line between belief and suspicion had been permanently blurred. Because now, every sermon was filtered through doubt, every healing through skepticism, every appearance through the shadow of that unanswered question: what really happened during those missing weeks? And as the years went on, the mystery didn't fade. it deepened. In the next section, we step inside the aftermath, the trials, the internal conflicts, the personal costs of fame, and the unseen battles that followed Aimee Semple McPherson long after the headlines faded. Because surviving the disappearance. After the disappearance, Aimee Semple McPherson was never just a preacher again. She was a symbol, contested, scrutinized, debated in pulpits and newspapers alike. Every step she took carried weight. Every word she spoke was examined not only for spiritual meaning, but for hidden motives. The mystery of her vanishing had transformed her from an evangelist into a public spectacle, and America was watching closely. Yet Aimee refused to retreat. She returned to Angelus Temple with the same commanding presence, the same dramatic delivery, and the same unshakable conviction that God had preserved her for a reason. The sanctuary filled again. Choirs sang. Hands were lifted. People testified of healing and salvation. On the surface, the ministry thrived. But beneath the revival fire, cracks were spreading. The pressure of leadership, celebrity, and controversy bore down relentlessly. Aimee lived in a world where admiration and accusation coexisted daily. One moment she was hailed as God's chosen instrument, the next she was ridiculed as a fraud. This constant tension began to take its toll emotionally, physically, and spiritually. Her inner circle grew smaller. Trust became fragile. Loyal allies turned cautious, afraid of being pulled into scandal. Staff members whispered. Board members questioned decisions. Financial scrutiny intensified as critics accused her of misusing funds, despite her extensive charitable work. Each accusation chipped away at the foundation she had built with such passion. And yet, she kept performing miracles, at least according to those who believed. Stories continued to emerge of people walking again, of sickness vanishing, of lives transformed in moments of prayer. Supporters insisted that no deception could produce such fruit. Skeptics countered that emotion and suggestion were powerful tools. The debate became endless, and Aimee stood at the center of it all, absorbing the weight. Her personal life offered little refuge. She longed for companionship, but struggled to reconcile intimacy with her calling. Romantic rumors followed her constantly, some exaggerated, others possibly true. Each whisper fed the narrative that her life behind the pulpit was far more complicated than her sermons suggested. In 1931, she married again, this time to David Hutton, a singer associated with her ministry. At first, the marriage seemed hopeful, a chance at partnership, stability, and understanding. But fame is rarely kind to love. The union quickly deteriorated under the strain of public attention and private conflict. The divorce that followed was bitter and public. Accusations flew from both sides. Court documents exposed intimate details. Headlines feasted on the spectacle. Once again, Aimee's personal pain became national entertainment. For many observers, it confirmed what they already suspected, that her life was chaotic, dramatic, and unstable. For Aimee, it was devastating. She preached strength while battling loneliness. She proclaimed faith while wrestling doubt. She spoke of divine order while navigating personal disorder. The contradiction did not make her less human, it made her painfully human. And yet, even as her world fractured, her influence expanded. Angelus Temple remained a powerhouse. Her radio broadcasts reached millions. She pioneered techniques that modern churches would later adopt without question: branding, storytelling, multimedia worship. Long before televangelism became common, Aimee understood how to communicate faith in a rapidly changing world. She was ahead of her time, too far ahead, perhaps, because innovation often invites resistance, especially when it challenges tradition. Religious leaders accused her of turning worship into entertainment. Others feared her growing influence as a woman in a male-dominated religious landscape. Some opposition was theological, much of it was cultural. Aimee stood at the intersection of progress and provocation, and standing there was exhausting. Health issues began to surface. She suffered breakdowns attributed to stress and overwork. Hospitalizations followed. Doctors urged rest. Critics interpreted her illnesses as divine judgment or emotional instability. Supporters saw them as the cost of sacrificial ministry. Still, she returned, again and again. Each comeback sermon carried urgency, as though she sensed time slipping through her fingers. Her preaching became more intense, more focused on eternity, suffering, and perseverance. Those closest to her noticed a shift. The flamboyance remained, but there was also weariness behind the smile. She had given everything: her youth, her privacy, her reputation, and still the question that haunted her never left. Would history remember her faith or her scandal? As the years progressed, the cultural climate shifted. New voices emerged. The spotlight drifted. Aimee was no longer the singular phenomenon she once was. Younger evangelists arose, borrowing techniques she had pioneered, often without acknowledging the cost she paid to blaze that trail. Yet, as even public attention waned, the unresolved mystery of her vanishing lingered like an echo. It followed her into every interview, every biography, every retelling of her life. No explanation ever satisfied everyone, and perhaps none ever would, because the truth, whatever it was, had been buried beneath layers of belief, bias, and time. By the mid-1940s, Aimee Semple McPherson was physically weakened, but spiritually defiant. She had survived grief, scandal, ridicule, and isolation. She had been lifted to extraordinary heights and dragged through public humiliation. Few lives burned this brightly. Few paid this dearly. And as her health declined, one final chapter approached, quiet, unexpected, and filled with questions that would outlive her. In the next section, we confront the final days of Aimee Semple McPherson, the circumstances surrounding her death, and the legacy she left behind, a legacy still debated, still polarizing, and still powerful nearly a century later, because some lives don't end, they linger. And Aimee Semple McPherson was never meant to be forgotten. By the mid-1940s, the fire that once propelled Aimee Semple McPherson across continents now burned more quietly. She was no longer the unstoppable force of her youth, racing from city to city, captivating crowds with tireless energy. The years had taken their toll. Illness clung to her body. Fatigue settled deep into her bones. The woman who once commanded America's attention now fought battles most people never saw. But even in decline, Aimee refused to fade gently. She continued preaching when she could, often seated, sometimes visibly weak, yet still unmistakably commanding. Her voice, though softer, carried conviction. Those who listened closely sensed urgency, as if she understood that her time was narrowing and every word mattered. Behind the scenes, her life had grown increasingly isolated. Many of the allies who once surrounded her were gone, some by death, others by disillusionment, others simply worn down by years of controversy. Leadership within her organization had shifted. Control was no longer entirely hers. Decisions were filtered through committees and advisors who often viewed her as both a founder and a liability. That reality cut deeply. Angelus Temple, the monument to her vision, continued without her constant presence. Services were held, programs ran smoothly. The machine she built no longer required her hand on every lever. For a woman whose identity was so deeply tied to calling and command, this quiet sidelining was painful. And yet, she still believed. Those close to her described moments of tenderness, private prayers, handwritten notes, quiet reflections. She spoke less of fame and more of eternity, less of defense and more of surrender. The bravado that once shielded her had thinned, revealing vulnerability few had witnessed before. On September 27, 1944, Aimee Semple McPherson was found dead in her home in Oakland, California. She was just 53 years old. The official cause of death was listed as an accidental overdose of sedatives, medication prescribed to help her sleep. No suicide note, no definitive evidence of foul play, just another sudden ending that raised more questions than answers. Once again, uncertainty surrounded her. Some believed it was truly accidental, a tragic miscalculation by a woman whose body had endured decades of stress and pain. Others whispered darker theories. Was it intentional? Was it despair? Or was it simply exhaustion catching up with someone who had given too much for too long? As in life, so in death, Aimee Semple McPherson remained a mystery. Her funeral drew massive crowds. Admirers came to pay their respects, many openly weeping. They remembered the woman who fed the hungry during the Great Depression, who preached hope to the broken, who dared to believe that God could still intervene in human suffering. Critics, however, remained unconvinced. Editorials rehashed scandals. Commentators questioned her credibility even in death. The same divide that defined her life followed her into the grave. She was mourned and doubted in equal measure. But history rarely settles arguments cleanly. What could not be denied was her impact. Aimee Semple McPherson changed American Christianity forever. She pioneered mass evangelism in the modern age. She harnessed radio when most churches feared it. She transformed sermons into narratives, worship into experience, faith into something people could feel. She shattered barriers for women in ministry long before society was ready. She stood on stages that women were told they did not belong on and refused to step down. For every critic who called her excessive, there were countless others who found faith through her voice. Her methods became templates, her risks became roadmaps, her influence echoed through generations of pastors, broadcasters, and religious leaders who adopted her strategies, often without acknowledging her name. Yet her story was never just about innovation. It was about cost, the cost of calling, the cost of visibility, the cost of being deeply spiritual and profoundly human. Aimee lived under a microscope, her faith scrutinized, her failures amplified, her successes questioned. She carried the burden of expectation from believers who wanted perfection and critics who expected collapse. She was allowed no middle ground. And perhaps that is why her story still resonates, because she represents a tension that has never gone away, the tension between belief and doubt, charisma and authenticity, public faith and private struggle. She reminds us that extraordinary impact often comes wrapped in contradiction. After her death, Angelus Temple continued. The Foursquare Church endured, spreading across continents. Her name remained etched into religious history, taught in seminaries, debated in biographies, referenced in sermons. But the woman herself remained elusive. Was she truly a vessel of divine power? A gifted performer who blurred sacred lines? A victim of her own ambition? Or a sincere believer crushed beneath the weight of expectation? Perhaps she was all of these. Perhaps she was none. And maybe that ambiguity is the most honest legacy she could have left behind. Because saints are rarely simple, and pioneers are almost never comfortable. As time moved forward, the noise faded, but the questions endured. New generations discovered her story and asked the same things America once asked. What really happened? What should we believe? How do we judge a life lived so publicly, yet so privately wounded? In the final section, we step back and confront the full legacy of Aimee Semple McPherson, not to crown her or condemn her, but to understand why her story still matters today and what it reveals about faith, fame, and the fragile humanity behind both. Because some lives don't ask to be explained, they ask to be remembered. Honestly.
Long after the crowds dispersed and the headlines faded, Aimee Semple McPherson remained, not in flesh, but in influence. History has a way of simplifying lives, turning people into heroes or villains, saints or scandals. But Aimee resisted that flattening. Nearly a century later, she still defies easy classification, lingering in the uncomfortable space between inspiration and controversy. And that may be exactly why her story still matters. Modern megachurches, televangelists, and global ministries operate in a world Aimee helped create. The dramatic sermons, the emotional altar calls, the use of media to spread faith beyond walls. These are now commonplace, but in her time, they were revolutionary. She didn't just preach the message, she changed the method. Before cameras filled sanctuaries and sermons reached living rooms, Aimee saw possibility. She understood that faith could travel through wires and airwaves, that storytelling could awaken belief, and that the church could speak the language of the culture without surrendering its soul. Many who followed adopted her innovations, few acknowledged her cost. Because trailblazers rarely receive gratitude, only resistance. As conversations around faith and leadership evolved, especially concerning women, Aimee's life took on new relevance. She stood on platforms women were forbidden to occupy. She commanded authority in spaces that denied it. She endured scrutiny far harsher than her male counterparts ever faced. Mistakes that would have been forgiven in men became indictments when committed by her. Emotion that was praised in others became hysteria in her. Confidence became arrogance. Visibility became suspicion. And still, she stood. This does not mean she was flawless. It means she was human. Aimee lived in a tension many public figures still face today, the demand to be authentic yet perfect, vulnerable yet invincible, relatable yet above reproach. She lived before social media, yet endured its pressures in print and radio, her every move magnified and dissected. She paid for visibility with her privacy. She paid for influence with isolation. She paid for calling with exhaustion. And perhaps the greatest tragedy is not that she was controversial, but that she was never allowed to simply be complicated. The mystery of her disappearance still fuels debate. Some remain convinced it was staged. Others insist it was exactly as she described, a terrifying ordeal misunderstood by skeptics. No new evidence has emerged to close the case definitively, and maybe it never will. But focusing solely on that mystery risks missing the larger truth. Because even if the disappearance had never happened, Aimee Semple McPherson would still be one of the most influential religious figures of the 20th century. Her life cannot be reduced to one unanswered question, just as no life can be reduced to its darkest moment. What remains undeniable is this: millions were changed by her ministry. People found faith, people found hope, people found meaning in moments when the world offered none. During economic collapse, she fed the hungry. During spiritual drought, she spoke life. During cultural resistance, she refused silence. These are not illusions, these are records. At the same time, her life stands as a caution, a warning about the dangers of unchecked pressure, about the toll of constant performance, about how quickly admiration can turn to condemnation. Aimee's story asks uncomfortable questions we still struggle to answer today. How do we judge leaders who inspire many but stumble personally? How do we balance skepticism with grace? How do we honor impact without excusing harm? And perhaps most importantly, how do we allow faith to coexist with humanity? She never asked to be immortalized, she asked to be obedient. Whether one believes she succeeded depends largely on where one stands, but perhaps the most honest conclusion is this: Aimee Semple McPherson was neither the myth her enemies created, nor the flawless icon her admirers desired. She was something far more difficult. She was real. And real lives leave complicated legacies. Today, Angelus Temple still stands. The Foursquare Church continues around the world. Her name remains in books, documentaries, debates, and sermons. New generations discover her and ask the same question America once asked: who was she really? And the answer remains layered. She was a preacher who believed miracles were possible, a communicator who understood her time better than most, a woman who carried extraordinary calling in an era unprepared to support her, a leader lifted high and left alone when the weight became unbearable. In the end, perhaps her story is not meant to be solved, but understood, not to be judged from a distance, but examined with humility, because her life reflects something timeless, the collision between divine ambition and human fragility. And that collision has never stopped shaping history. Aimee Semple McPherson did not vanish into obscurity, she vanished into legacy. And whether remembered with reverence or reservation, one truth remains unchallenged: she changed the world she lived in. And the echo of her voice, passionate, imperfect, unwavering, can still be heard by those willing to listen. Not asking for agreement, only remembrance.
As we close the remarkable story of Aimee Semple McPherson, one thing is clear. She was a woman ahead of her time, a force of faith, a pioneer of modern ministry, and a figure surrounded by mystery that still captivates us today. Her life was filled with miracles, controversies, triumphs, and trials, each chapter reminding us of the incredible power and the heavy cost of influence, visibility, and devotion. Now it's your turn to reflect. Do you believe Aimee's disappearance was real or staged? Can faith and ambition coexist without conflict? Was she a true miracle worker or a masterful communicator? How much should public figures be judged for personal struggles? Did her innovations change the course of modern Christianity? Could anyone survive her life's pressures today? What part of her story inspires you the most? Drop your answers in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video so others can uncover her incredible story too.